Hey, everybody. So, this episode, we are reviewing The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It was written in the late 1800s. And I have this old copy from, I think, the 70s, and it says on there that it's worth 35 cents. But guess how much they charged me? $7. I don't know if you can see that.
Inflation's real.
But it's okay. It's still a pretty cool copy. This young guy in England in the late 1800s is being painted by a friend of his, and the painter's friend who is always hanging out with them because he finds them interesting. And this guy, Dorian Gray, is extremely handsome and so good looking to the painter and basically to everybody that, you know, the painter's obsessed with him and needs to paint him. And
it's like his muse.
Yeah, he's kind of essentially a muse, but he kind of like is obsessed with him. And they're always telling him, you are so good looking and so handsome.
You have nothing to worry about.
And you have nothing to worry about. The world is going to be open because you're wealthy and you are so good looking. And the other friend, Lord Henry, are saying, oh, you know, you're so lucky to have this. And the other is kind of saying like, well, yes, you are, but what happens when it fades? And he kind of messes with Dorian Gray's mind. And then it gets to a point where he meets this theater actress who's Sybil Vane, who is beautiful, and she's this great actress. And he invites his friends to meet her. And after they start dating, essentially. And
they never date in Victorian England.
Okay, well, you know what I mean. Court. Okay, once he's courting her, and she, she calls him Prince Charming. They're in love, and he ends up saying, "Oh, my friends have to meet you. They have to see you. They're going to fall in love with you, and they're going to see what I see." Because another problem with their relationship is that he's an aristocrat. He's wealthy, from the wealthy class, and she's from like the middle class or poor class, and so they're like, yeah, I don't know if this is a great idea, but we'll humor you because we're friends. So like, let's do it. And they go there, and Sybil puts on a terrible performance, and Basil and Lord Henry, they're kind of like, wow, she's an awful actress. Like, what is Dorian Gray doing? Like, she's pretty, but like, ugh, what are we doing here? And Dorian's like, I don't understand. She's been so good every time. I don't know why she's performing so poorly, but like, you're right. I got to end this. He's like so embarrassed and vain that he goes to Sybil afterwards and says, this isn't working out. It's not you, it's me. And
you're not who I thought you were.
Yeah. And Sybil is kind of like, well, I realized that, you know, performing was fake and now I'm really in love. Mm-hmm. So acting out romance just seems so silly and pointless to me that I don't want to do it ever again now that I found true love. Mm-hmm. And he's like, oh, sorry you feel that way because we're done. And then she commits suicide. And her brother says, like, if he ever hurts you, I will murder him. I don't care that he's Prince Charming or rich. If he hurts you, I will kill the man.
Well, what's interesting too is that the brother was younger than her. She was older and he was younger, and he's like 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And I was like, the whole dynamic between the brother and the sister was weird, in my opinion. Incestuous, in my opinion.
I think he was just protective. But anyway.
Okay.
So that happens. So she commits suicide after being broken up with. And he starts to see himself as kind of a menacingly ugly, you know, arrogant, evil person, basically. And it kind of starts to haunt him. Looking at this picture. So there's this whole thing about how he ends up becoming this degenerate who ruins women's reputations by kind of hanging out with them and kind of banging them and leaving them. Mm-hmm. And also kind of finds these weird hobbies and becomes obsessed with certain things. And he ends up turning a friend into like a drug addict and just kind of becomes this horrible person. And it's funny because as he realizes, what am I doing? I love this woman. He ends up wanting to tell her, you know, I'm sorry for doing that. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. But then he finds out that she died. And then it gets even crazier because now 20 years later, he gets so enraged by his friend Basil, who comes to his house, the painter, mm-hmm. and says, I need the painting. I want to see the painting. I haven't seen it in a while. And like, I just want to make sure that the rumors aren't true about these things that people are saying about you. And Dorian Gray gets so enraged that he murders him. He stabs him. And then he has another guy come over and he's like a scientist, so he kind of like gives it an acid bath to disintegrate the body. And the guy's like, I don't really want to do this, but he blackmails him. So he does it. And then that guy ends up killing himself.
Eventually.
And it the brother catches up with Dorian Gray, but Dorian Gray didn't age physically in his face. Mm-hmm. So Dorian Gray, when James finally catches up to him, he basically hears the Prince Charming moniker and is like, oh, that must be the guy, because he catches him in a whorehouse. And so he finally catches Dorian Gray and he's about to kill him. But then he looks at Dorian Gray's face and he ends up saying, wait a minute, the guy that dated, the Prince Charming guy that dated my sister and ended up making her, causing her to kill himself, he
should be a certain age.
Yeah, now he should be 40. But this guy still looks like he's in his 20s, so it can't be this person. And Dorian Gray's like, oh, thank God.
He's like, you're right. It's not me.
It can't be me. And that was another funny thing about the story is that everyone, the way that Oscar Wilde writes is that everyone cries everything. Everything's very affected and like dramatic. So when Dorian Gray talks, it's like, oh, I can't believe it. Mm-hmm. I thought the characters were developed and they had distinct characters, which I thought was interesting. Lord Henry is kind of this, philosophical troublemaker who can't shut his mouth and who really doesn't care. Like he talks about women in a certain way. And I liked how the other characters, they kind of combat it sometimes. Sometimes they're like, oh my God, he's right. But other times they're like, oh, why do you think that way?
Or like say, hey, why do you hang with this guy who is like kind of an asshole?
Yeah. So I thought that was really good. I liked Dorian, being young and impressionable and kind of having these crises in his head, where sometimes it's good to be really good looking and have money, but then also it shows some of the downsides it can bring, especially if you are introspective.
Yeah.
And I thought the Sybil character was interesting. I mean, overall, I liked it. There was a lot going on. It was a shortish book. The lull in between when Sybil commits suicide and when Dorian Gray kills Basil, it's kind of a lull because it's, Oscar Wilde is just describing the hobbies that Dorian Gray picked up and the degeneracy that he partook in to where he he started collecting gems and diamonds that princes and kings and queens around the world wore or were adorned on their clothing, things like that. And, talked about his relationship with the painting as he got older. But yeah, overall, I thought it was really good. There are a bunch of other wrinkles too in there that I thought was interesting. Like there's the friends at the dinner party who have distinct ideas and relationships with each other and thoughts. And there's also the like one of them is like, he considers being a writer because he has all this knowledge and he finds it interesting, but he realizes that there's no industry for it at the time, so he wouldn't be able to get paid, so he's like, I'm not doing that. I think in such a short book with so few characters, you really get a lot of different perspectives from rich people and wealthy people at that time, and not just on wealthy people problems, but also what they thought of the poor, what they thought of this, what they thought of that. And I found it really interesting and fun. Mm-hmm. What were your thoughts?
I mean, I think the version that I read the Barnes & Noble version of the Dorian Gray. So at the beginning, it gave kind of like a brief background of Oscar Wilde. And one of the things that I thought was funny was, so apparently he was very mad because the reception of Dorian Gray wasn't really well, because the critics were complaining about how silly it was, because he's a very verbose writer and he gets very flowery and talks about things. And I'm not gonna lie, sometimes when he goes on those rants of the script things, I kind of space out because where are we going? I want to get to the next thing. But the critics didn't like the pictures of Dorian Gray. But Oscar Wilde has his own opinion of critics, and I think he makes it clear in the book his opinion of critics, especially when like in the beginning of the book, Basil's work wasn't well received in the Royal Academy. So the portrait was supposed to be his best work and it's going to be accepted. So it was like hearing some of that commentary that was noted in the preface about Oscar, like his feelings about society, which was kind of nuanced in the book. I mean, it was enjoyable. There were lulls. I think it's like the whole thing with the picture of like the focus of vanity and being young and youthful. And it was funny because every time Lord Henry would say something, no matter how much Dorian Gray read, Henry always thought himself the smartest one in the group. And would always put down, like, oh, don't worry, you're pretty face. You don't need a brain. just be pretty. Just live on that. You're gonna be fine. So that was like kind of humorous at times. But the biggest thing in the whole book was like how the whole thing that Basil was like, oh, I captured your essence. And it was a whole thing about how wanting to capture that and reflect in the portrait. And then I think Dorian, to some degree, hearing that conversation that happened when he was sitting for the painting about capturing one's soul or essence, and the painting in Dorian's mind kind of having that grimacing or in some ways also aging, because the whole part of Dorian's thing is like not wanting to age. He wanted to be young forever. He wanted to keep his youth. But the painting itself was kind of like mocking him and also aging, or when he did something bad, he thought the painting was like mocking him further. And then hence why he hid it in the attic to get it away from him. But he every so often, out of curiosity, would see, well, did the painting change? Is it going to be the young youthful, or is it going to be like the other version that no one sees? So, I mean, it was an interesting commentary. I felt it's not for me, but I could appreciate for the time when it was written and it being like a classic, and I'm happy that I read it because it was something that I too always wanted to read. I found it enjoyable, but also another thing that I find funny is that it was kind of commentary, like if you had money, you can get away with anything. For example, when Sybil first died, for some reason, Lord Henry's like, well, you got to make sure they don't trace it back to you, so you don't get. So like the whole time, Dorian's like at his house, like not wanting to leave. So I'm like trying to check, like the newspapers, like, well, did they note me? Like, did anyone figure out it was me? And then Lord Henry was a dick and mailed the newspaper article and circled it, like, well, they didn't find you yet. You can see. Do you remember that? When they circled the newspaper, be like, oh, look, it's saying suicide. You're good. You can come out of hiding now.
Yeah, true. Because no one had actually
seen him,
yeah.
Because it wasn't like a well-known theater that typically aristocracy would go to. This is kind of like where not peasants, but lower, like it was like a theater for lower ranked individuals.
Well, that
like a penny theater, I think is what they called it.
Well, that brings up some questions because there was a time when women were not allowed to act, but I'm guessing in the theater in London. But I'm guessing by the late 1800s that wasn't a thing anymore. I know in William Shakespeare's time,
only men.
It was only men, but I wonder if that was the case. I'm also curious. I want to talk about the Dorian Gray not being received well when it came out. First off, you're right. I think it's hilarious not hearing you say that Oscar Wilde was pissed at critics, because that seems like a theme among all writers throughout all time.
But Oscar Wilde specifically wrote a book about art criticism as well. Like I know. But, so like he had a thing with critics. He hated them because none of the critics at the time liked his work, so he was pissed.
Well, Edgar Allan Poe, I remember he had the same problem where he died penniless because no one liked that shit.
Yeah.
But I think it wasn't until like there were books and writers that got famous, but I don't think they became celebrities or anything like that until the 1950s with Ernest Hemingway. So I wonder, who was reading this? Did Oscar Wilde write this for poor people to consume, where they could say, look how silly and hypocritical and ridiculous the wealthy are? Or was it still for wealthy people? That's something that I would
I think about. One thing that was interesting, because he's Irish, because they made in the intro made it a point to say that he was an Irish writer and he wanted to prove that coming from Ireland, like there's good literature or writers that are coming out of it. That was also part of his goal. There was also the commentary of his sexuality, which people kind of said could have caused his writing to suffer by critics, because he, even though he married and later divorced, he didn't hide who he was.
Yeah, my copy just goes right into it. Oh no,
You just skipped it.
there is a preface, but it's only
Mine
a
was
page. It's
pages
only a
long.
page and a half, and it's by Oscar Wilde, and he basically thinks that art is useless and pointless.
Well, he says art is for art's sake. It's come
Right.
from that saying. So.
And but yeah, do you have any other thoughts on it?
No, I think it was like interesting. I'm glad I read it, but at some points I'm like, where are we going here? We got to speed it up.
I mean, it was a little boring getting through that part that I described earlier, but everything else I thought was, the things that were coming out of Lord Henry's mouth, it gets, like, his dialogue, it gets you to think like, oh, at first that makes sense. And then you think about it a little more and you're like, wow, you're just a dick.
Well, yeah.
That is not correct. And
like the whole thing about his wife, like, yeah, I cheat on my wife and she cheats on me too. It's okay.
She divorced him and he was like, yeah, whatever.
It's like, I'll find someone else. It's okay.
But yeah, it was cool. It was interesting. Now I've read a handful of novels from writers in the 1800s. Like I read Frankenstein. I read Dorian Gray. I read the little sci-fi book.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's called Flatlands. It's kind of cool though. But it's just what I love about these stories. What I love about these stories is that you realize that there were people from every era, every decade, every time that remind us of people that we know today. People have the same thought process, right or wrong, people act the same way. And I know it's kind of like a lot of people are going to say like, well, duh, yeah, we're all human.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to forget, that, and that a lot of these thoughts that we have, they're not new.
Yeah.
And we're still, a part of it is comedic, to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, but it's also kind of depressing.
Yeah.
how we haven't evolved in so many ways, even though it feels like we're so far into the future in relation to that,
Yeah.
But yeah, so how many Kisas do you give it?
I gave it 2 Kisas.
2 Kisas?
It's not my favorite. And I too read Frankenstein. If I had to say a Victorian era book that I loved reading and appreciated, I would say Wuthering Heights by the Bronte sisters. And then Jane Eyre and Frankenstein. Those are my top 3. Yes, all women. I read The Art Criticism that was due to school by Oscar Wilde, which was interesting theory. I just couldn't get in. It took me a while to get used to his writing style and also to get into the book. About all the books that I read from that time period, I don't think The Pictures of Dorian Gray is my favorite. I think but I'm glad that I read it. I mean, 2 stars is good. I'm not saying his writing is bad.
2 stars is good.
I just couldn't get into it. It just didn't intrigue me at all. Other books that I read from that time period, I feel like did it better in my opinion.
So what did you like? What made it better? Those other stories? Was it just the premise of it, or was it the way the characters are written?
I don't know. I mean, like Jane. Don't get me wrong. Jane Eyre was also long. It was like a 400 or 500 thing book, and there was a long lull in between when actions were happening. But that intrigued me more because I think those books maybe it was like not a power dynamic, but like a woman, for Jane Eyre, for example, she was a governess and he was a lord, and then he hid his wife in the attic and she burned the house down. Like that was kind of like drama and Phil, but it was like, I don't know, it just intrigued me more. And then Frankenstein, I felt like had a more interesting premise of having the monster and then him roaming and people being scared, and I don't know, I just like the writing intrigued me more. So
having gone to school and taken classes on art history,
yeah,
are you just not interested in other critiques or philosophical analysis of art? Is that not something that you care about anymore?
No,
because this, like Lord Henry, to me is basically Oscar Wilde, him kind of saying his thought pretty much. I don't, not necessarily his thoughts, but that's where the philosophy comes from.
Yeah.
It's, Lord Henry has his thoughts on what it means to age or to be beautiful, what it means to.
But it was, I think maybe because there was a lot of long diatribes of talking and these long speeches that I'm like,
So if someone were to speak like that in real life, someone you know,
yeah.
you would say, I don't want to hear what this person says. I don't want to talk to this
No,
person.
I don't. I wouldn't say that. Can you give me the short version? Can you give me the short version? I don't need this winded speech. Can we get to the point?
Okay. Well, I'll give it 4 stars. I thought it was entertaining.
Was it though?
I was entertained.
Okay, keep
Because
going.
to me, the characters were very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I thought a lot of the irony in a lot of the situations the characters put themselves in, that's fun for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that they're realistic to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a woman committing suicide because she got broken up with. To me, it's a unique character that they brought, who, her mother's an actress.
Mm-hmm.
Sybil's mother's an actress, and she's aging. And she's just kind of like, I want you to marry someone rich,
Mm-hmm.
but you also have to be careful. I think, at least I remember, that's what I remember, or that she, the idea that she is such a great actor because she's never really experienced the things that she's necessarily acted about,
Mm-hmm.
and then she finds it in real life and acting just makes 0 sense to her now.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes along with the idea that Oscar Wilde has where it's like art is silly compared to real life. That's funny to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. The characters seem complex.
Mm-hmm.
Even though there isn't a lot of time to develop them. And it's because it focuses more on the character's dialogue. By the time Dorian Gray kills Basil, that's not even the most scandalous thing that we feel like he did.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it was how he treated Sybil and how he acted when he was having the painting made. And up to that point,
Mm-hmm.
where he hates the painting because it reminds him, now all of a sudden it's like, why does the Dorian Gray in the painting get to be young forever, and I have to age? And those are the way that Oscar Wilde writes these characters. To me, it still feels unique.
Mm-hmm.
We've read a lot of books to this point. I haven't really read characters that were written or developed in quite that way in such a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, and it takes place in the 1800s.
Yeah. So my question to you is, how did you feel about the ending? Like, how quickly? I feel like the ending happened real quick, and he was like, I'm done. We're finishing this now. Like, all of a sudden, like, the build-up of him going crazy and going in, and all of a sudden, it cuts to black, and the 2 people outside heard a scream, and then, because in the end, he gets, basically towards the end of the book, he gets so self-obsessed with all the actions that he's done, plus, like, the painting drives him mad to some degree, that he's going to essentially destroy the painting. So, like, he essentially runs upstairs to slash it, cut to black, 2 people outside heard a scream, and everyone's like, oh, this is Lord Dorian Gray's house. Something must have happened. And then all of a sudden, the cop goes in, the cop comes out, and is like, yeah, he did. And you're like, what?
So yeah, the first half of the book was way more interesting to me, and it does feel like the second half was not as interesting and felt rushed. But that first half alone for me carries it.
Okay, the first half is your 4-star. What is the second half?
We're not doing this. We're not taking the average of the 2. But the second half, I mean, yeah, probably like a 2.5. But it doesn't matter because the first half carried it so strongly for me that I still thought it was overall great. Felt fresh, even though it's over 100 years old. It was funny. It was a little overly dramatic. The characters were interesting and felt full and realistic because I was able to, to me, I can identify these characters and people that I've interacted with or know in real life for good and bad. So yeah, I guess that's it, right?
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for watching and hanging out with us. And we're going to have another video for you next month.
Yep. Like, subscribe, drop a comment. Let us know what 18th century book that you actually like. And also, if you read Dorian Gray, do you agree? Who do you agree with more? So leave a comment. We hope to see you in the next one.
See ya.